Our presenter today is Dr. Catherine Clements, the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator at IFAS Extension, Sarasota County. And today we have a special guest, Tony Clements, who is the Park Manager at Oscar Scherer State Park. So I'll let you guys take it away.
So welcome everyone. I will introduce myself a little bit more here. I am Dr. Catherine Clements, the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator at IFAS Extension, Sarasota County, as Cassidy, my lovely intern, just mentioned. Here's a little bit of background on me. I won't go through all this, but I do a number of programs here for our Sarasota County Extension Office, including the Florida Master Naturalist Program, and something called the LIFE program, which I also partner with the state parks and a number of other agencies to do. This is a program for 3rd through 5th graders in our Sarasota County school system to introduce them to natural resources concepts, our local ecology and conservation ethics. So I have a bachelor's in environmentalist studies, and then I spent 12 to 15 years being a physician before I decided to come full circle and come back to my love of teaching environmental education. So we have with us today my husband, Tony Clements, who both of us live in Oscar Scherer State Park. We have had the honor of being able to live there. Well, I've been there a little over 20 years, and Tony's been there even longer than me. And we get to bring our 2 children up in that wonderful environment, and we have basically a zoo that lives there with us as well. So lots of different animals that also share our home with us. So my husband will be joining us partway through the presentation. He's here now, but he'll be talking partway through the presentation. He's going to provide us with a land manager's view of prescribed fire, how they use prescribed fire as a management tool. So he is one of our experts that will be sharing with us today. For those of you that aren't familiar with extension offices, there are extension offices in all 67 counties of our state and in every state in our country. They are associated with our land grant universities. And the job of extension and those of us that work here for extension is to share information from the professors and researchers at the University of Florida with our communities to help solve issues and just basically make life better for the residents in our individual counties. Here at our Sarasota County Extension Office, we have a wide range of programming. We have a really, actually very large office for an extension office, and we provide lots of assistance in all these different areas that you see here on the screen. For natural resources, I'm just one of the faculty members. We have people that specifically work with the marine environment, with our freshwater ecosystems, with waste reduction, with chemicals in the environment, insects, pests, all sorts of things. So please feel free to visit our website to learn more about our services and to contact us if you need help in any of these areas. And of course, right now, when we're all in our COVID situation and many of us are working from home or doing things virtually, we do not have in-person classes going on, but we have lots and lots of webinars. So please check those out and find something else that you might be interested in. Here are some of the program icons or logos that you may be familiar with that are managed through the extension offices. The Master Naturalist Program, which I'm a lead instructor for, is up there in the right-hand corner. Master Gardeners are a University of Florida extension program as well. So all of these programs are run through our office. And then our county just likes us to remind you, if you have not done your census yet, please do your census online. You can just go to census.gov. This information is really important in terms of providing funding and community support. So please fill out your census if you haven't yet. All right, so let's get to our webinar today on prescribed fire. So these are the topics that we're going to cover today. I'm going to give you a little bit of definitions that we use when we're talking about fire. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of fire in the Southeast, some of our fire-dependent species. We're going to talk about actually fire in Florida as well, and then some recent wildfire examples here locally. And then Tony's going to join us and discuss the benefits of prescribed fire as a management tool and his perspective in terms of why and how they burn at Oscar Scherer State Park. And then we sort of have a photo journey after he's done speaking. At the end, I've gone out on a number of recent burns and taken photos of those at Oscar Scherer State Park. So we'll show you some of those pictures as well. And then, as Cassie mentioned, we'll have our question and answer session at the end. But if you don't want to forget your question, just type it in the chat box and then we'll get to it at the end. All right, so here we go. Some definitions that we use when we're talking about fire. First of all, today we're mostly talking about prescribed fire. So what is it? Prescribed fire is a carefully and strategically controlled application of fire by a team of fire managers under specified weather and other conditions that help to restore the health to our ecosystems that depend on fire here in the Southeast. So we're gonna explain all that a little bit more and show you lots of examples. Prescribed fire is also carried out in accordance with applicable laws, policies, and regulations. And we used to call these controlled burns. And then really the lingo is not really correct because we can't really ever completely control a burn. When we talk about prescribed fires, then it is the connotation of a prescription for the forest. Just like a medical doctor writes a prescription for you when you're sick to help you get better, when our forest and other ecosystems that depend on fire have not been burned in a while, a prescription or prescribed fire is a very tightly, carefully controlled situation, not completely controlled always, but controlled application where we are trying to restore the health of the forest or scrub or other fire dependent environment. So that's why we switched over to calling it prescribed fire. So here are some other definitions. Wildfire is an unplanned, unwanted wildland fire where the objective is to suppress or put the fire out. So those are the ones we don't like. Those are the ones we see on the news, especially in California and other western areas of our country. And then there's a more generic term that most people are not as familiar with, but we use. It's called wildland fire. A wildland fire can be a wildfire or a prescribed fire. It's basically any fire that occurs in vegetation or natural fuels. So this one is not dependent on how the fire got set. It's just fire in a natural area. And then I already sort of said the words fire suppression. That's the act of extinguishing or preventing fire. And in the age of Smokey the Bear, a couple decades ago, really fire suppression was often the objective where we were trying to suppress fires, especially in our developed regions throughout the Southeast and the western part of the US. But we started to realize that that's actually not a good management tool, because when we suppress fires in our natural areas that depend on fire, the ecosystem starts to succeed or change, and we start to lose habitat. Also, if we suppress fires, then there isn't a natural way to get rid of fuel, so that when there is a lightning strike or someone throws a cigarette out their car window and a wildfire starts, it is much harder to actually put that wildfire out, and we run the risk of having a more extreme situation and a more devastating wildfire. So fire suppression is sometimes necessary if there's a wildfire that is threatening structures, but fire suppression is not necessarily always the objective anymore. So fire requires 3 ingredients to make it happen. It is a chemical reaction, and it requires oxygen, which of course is in plentiful abundance in the air. It requires some sort of source of heat. So sometimes we have control over that. We don't really have control over oxygen. And then also the third component is fuel. And fuel is very necessary for the fire to happen, and we often have control over that. That's part of why we do prescribe fires so that we decrease the fuel that's on the ground in case there is something like a lightning strike that could start this chemical reaction. And then wildland fire behavior is affected by many things. So once a fire is occurring in a natural area, whether it's a wildfire or a prescribed fire, the behavior of that fire is affected by weather conditions, topography, and the types of fuel. So we're not going to get too much into all of those details, but Tony will talk to you a little bit more about weather conditions and when they are writing a prescription and doing a prescribed fire, how they take many of these things into account. So let's talk a little bit about history of fire in the Southeast. So of course, as I mentioned, fire is a natural part of both the Florida and southeastern landscapes for thousands of years. Historically, fires were set both by lightning and people. And Native Americans and early Europeans used fire for a multitude of purposes. Of course, they could use fire to clear farmland for farming and agriculture. They would use fire to improve hunting and sort of flush the animals out. They would use fire to clear some land and facilitate travel. And Native Americans also use fire to clear the land to increase visibility and provide safety from other tribes. So they could see other tribes coming to them or coming towards them that could be aggressive. So it helped as a protective measure. So fire has been part of our human history in this area for thousands of years as well. What I find really interesting is when we look at some of these species that we call fire-dependent species, or sometimes even fire-adapted species. Hold on, I'm just admitting some people from the waiting room. Okay, so it's very interesting when we look at our fire-dependent or fire-adapted species. These are species, either plants or animals, that over time have evolved with fire. And when we look at their range map, so this one we're looking at our longleaf pine forest. Longleaf pine was the major species, and the longleaf pine forest was the dominant ecosystem of the southeastern coastal plain prior to timbering and turpentining. So now here in Florida, the pines you see, especially here in Sarasota County, are usually going to be southern slash pine, and occasionally we have a few longleaf pines left. We are making lots of efforts in the natural resource community to replant our longleaf pine forest because it's actually one of the ecosystems that has the highest biodiversity anywhere in the world. So there's a lot of efforts to try to restore these longleaf pine forests. But if you look at the range map on the bottom left of your screen, the green area shows historically where the longleaf pine range was throughout the southeast. And this is also very indicative of where fires are very historically common throughout the landscape of the southeast. Same thing, here's a pine lily. If you've had a chance to see a pine lily, we have these in some of our preserves in Sarasota County. They are a beautiful species and relatively rare. They are also considered a fire-dependent species, and you can see on the range map below that picture that also we're looking at a very similar range. Once again, the states and the areas along the southeastern coastal plain that historically have been molded by fire. Then we have a couple animals. These are near and dear to my heart. These are both pictures I've taken at Oscar Scherer State Park. Our Florida scrub jay is an endemic species that depends on fire-dependent habitats like the scrub or the scrubby flatwoods. And so our Florida scrub jay is not found anywhere else but in Florida, and it needs a very specific habitat to live in, and that habitat is maintained by fire to keep the sandy soils open for the Florida scrub jay to cache its acorns in. It keeps the scrubby oaks at a low level like the scrub jays like. They do not like many trees above 6 to 8 feet in height. So fire helps to keep a scrub or scrubby flatwood ecosystem just right for some of these species like the Florida scrub jay and our gopher tortoise. Below the Florida scrub jay on the map in gray is the historic range of where we would have found scrub jays quite a while ago, and the dark green stippled areas are where we currently find scrub jays. They are listed species. Here's our gopher tortoise. Our gopher tortoise is not endemic to Florida, but its range is just throughout the southeast down there on the map in brown. So once again, these species that have evolved and adapted over thousands of years with fire-dependent habitats and ecosystems are going to be found really only where fire happens. And if fire doesn't happen, we run the risk of losing these habitats and the species that inhabit them. All right, so wildfires, let's talk a little bit more about wildfires before we get to prescribed fire. So wildfires are not just a Western US issue. We hear a lot on the news about the wildfires, mostly in California, although they certainly occur in other Western states like Oregon and Washington State. But many large wildfires have also occurred in the southeastern US, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. And you see on the right here a picture of one of our most devastating wildfires, the 2016 Gatlinburg Chimney Tops 2 fire. So this occurred throughout the Gatlinburg and surrounding area in Tennessee. Over 17, oh, sorry, I forgot a zero there, but over 17,000 acres burned. So it was a pretty large fire for the Southeast. Unfortunately, 14 lives were lost and 2,400 structures were lost or destroyed. The Gatlinburg Chimney Tops 2 fire was one of our most costly fires throughout the entire United States, costing us almost $1 billion in damages. So you may have seen this on the news. You may remember hearing about this. So we learned a lot from this fire, and it has really informed some of the decisions that have been incorporated into fire management. Here's a map that I think is really interesting, especially when we're sitting here in Florida and talking about fire and wildfires. This is a map of where wildfires occur in the US. And so the darker regions are where wildfires don't really occur. So we don't really see a lot of wildfires in the northeastern and north central areas of our country. And then as you see more of the brighter oranges and yellow colors, that's where we get a lot of wildfires. So obviously we see that throughout our western states, but look at pretty much for the whole eastern half of our country, mostly it's Florida. There's a little bit in sort of the middle area of the East Coast right there, but most of where wildfires occur east of the Mississippi is going to be here in Florida. So switching over to talking more Florida specific, I just pulled some data from the FDACS, which is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services website. They manage a lot of things, but they also have a lot of information about fire as well as the Florida Forest Service does. So I just pulled some of the interesting or large fires over the last 30 years. There's a lot more that were listed than just these, but you can see some of the counties where these occurred. In 2018, we had a number of fires down in Collier County, and you can see there's a range of acreage. I sort of pulled some of the larger fires to show us how large some of those fires do get. Some of these Collier County fires were a little bit smaller, but still significant. This is a fire that if you were in Florida, especially in the Sarasota or Orlando or Tampa area back in 2008, you will remember this. I remember this being all over the news. This happened on I-4, sort of in between Tampa and Orlando. This was a 70 vehicle pileup. There were 20 larger like semi trucks or trailers and 50 cars involved. There were 10 accidents spread out over a 2-mile stretch of I-4 in Polk County. Unfortunately, 5 people were killed and over 30 more were injured. 15 miles of the interstate had to be closed. 6 tractor trailers burned completely. And what happened is smoke from a controlled burn, this is back when we used to call them controlled burns, smoke from a controlled burn the previous day that had gotten out of control sort of settled over this area on the interstate. And then fog also settled into that area. And if you watch a clip about this, or if you remember hearing about this, people talked about it like they were just driving, and this happened early in the morning. They were driving, and then all of a sudden it was just like they hit this blanket of fog and smoke, and they couldn't see anything. And all they could hear were the sounds of metal against metal as these different vehicles collided. This accident sparked another fire, and that was a 400-acre brush fire that happened. So this was a huge situation, unfortunately, and that's why it's so important, and why the Florida Forest Service and the burn managers take into account all the different weather conditions where the smoke is going to go to try to avoid situations like this. This is a recent fire. I was actually teaching a 5-week class on firescaping, which is about how to landscape your environment to reduce fire risk to your structures. I was teaching that class this past April, and right as I was teaching that class, this fire happened. And this was down at the Fort Myers, well, it's called the Southwest Florida International Airport, but it's the airport in Fort Myers. It was on April 3rd. And 11 fire departments were called to help suppress the fire. It was a fire that started near where a number of rental cars were parked. In fact, over 7,000 rental cars were parked in this grassy field because COVID-19 had already happened and people weren't traveling. And so the rental car companies had this excess of rental cars and nowhere to park them. So they parked them in this open grassy field. Somehow a wildfire started and then called for all of this to happen. 11 fire departments, firefighters had to work through the night and into the next day to get the fire out. The Florida Forest Service had to send 4 dozers to help create fire lines so that the fire didn't continue to spread, and to move some of the cars and the debris. Helicopters were called in from various agencies to drop water on the burning cars, and about half of the cars were saved. So about 3,500 were damaged or destroyed, and so about 3,500 were saved, or 3,850 as it says on the slide. And here are some pictures from that fire. So here's a picture of a firefighter fighting right up against some of those damaged cars. And then here's a long range shot, and you can see not only all the cars parked and the fire, but look in the center of the screen, you can see a helicopter. Look how tiny that helicopter is compared to the smoke plumes and the fire from those cars. Just really amazing to see. And then I found this as well that I found sort of laughable, but not. This occurred the next day on April 4th. I found this on CNN. So firefighters were called to a home in Brevard County, Florida, because of a blaze that was possibly ignited by fireworks and also some explosives, because it was a gender reveal party. So they were trying to set something off to indicate the gender of their child, and they basically started I believe a house fire and possibly even a wildfire as well, even though at the time there was actually a burn ban in the county. And the Florida Forest Service determines or helps determine if there should be burn bans within certain counties based on the conditions at the time. And April is one of our high fire risk months. So there was a burn ban when this happened. So don't set off fireworks to reveal the gender of your child, I guess. This is our peak wildfire season in Florida. You can see it varies throughout different states. So I have Florida circled in red. And so it starts, January is at the beginning here. So basically our peak fire season is March through June. That's this peak here. So we are currently out of our peak wildfire season. It doesn't mean that they can't happen, but it's less likely. Of course, now we're into hurricane season, so I guess it just doesn't stop for us here in Florida. This is a map I pulled when I was teaching the firescaping class. So this is a map of wildfires occurring in our state as of April 29th. This map is updated every 6 hours, so it gives you almost a real-time view of wildfires. In our state, the gold icons are wildfires that were contained at that point, and then the red icons are the ones that were not contained. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner, almost 1,000 acres were burning on April 29th as wildfire. So Cassidy pulled a picture for us today. So this is where we were this morning, and you can see that we only have, it looks like, 6 active wildfires. They're all north of where I'm sitting right now, at least, because I'm in Sarasota County. And they are all 100% contained, and there's only about 25 acres of fire currently occurring in our state as wildfire. So first of all, this is great news, and second of all, it's also very indicative that we are out of that peak wildfire season, and the map today doesn't look anything like the map did in April during peak wildfire season. And then I just thought I'd show you this too. This is a map indicating the open burn authorizations as of this morning. So the Florida Forest Service is the agency that's responsible for approving prescribed fires and pile burns. So Tony's going to talk to you more about how you write a prescription and the things they consider as burn managers. That then gets submitted to the Florida Forest Service for approval to burn on the day that you want to burn under the conditions you want to burn under. So right now we only have these open burn authorizations for today. So fire in Florida, of course, we are known as the lightning capital of the United States. We are not the lightning capital of the world, but we are the lightning capital of our country. And as we mentioned, long before humans were here, wildfires were caused by lightning, and that those fires spread naturally through the longleaf pine forest, scrub, and across the prairies, which are some of our main fire-dependent ecosystems in our state. Our plants and animals have adapted to these fires and are greatly dependent, not all of them, but the ones that are especially endemic to some of these ecosystems, they are greatly dependent on fire for maintaining their habitat for survival. About 6 of every 10 acres in Florida, which is nearly 22 million acres, are actually considered fire-dependent acres. And Tony's going to also elaborate a little bit on benefits of prescribed fire, but I'm just going to run down the list for you. Prescribed fire, so these are the fires that he's going to talk to you about that land managers, ranchers use to manage, and there's different management objectives. Our natural resource managers are going to use them for a number of situations to help manage our natural resources. But there are a number of benefits to prescribed fire, such as restoring and maintaining our natural communities. It improves and maintains the habitat for fire-adapted plants and animals, some of which we just mentioned. It encourages the growth of fire-adapted plant species. So some plant species only release their seeds when there is heat from the fire. Some plant species, their seeds only germinate when the soil gets hot due to a fire. So fire is going to encourage those specific species to live and produce. Also, prescribed fire can help manage invasive plant species. Sometimes, unfortunately, the invasive plants do well with fire though, so it's not a management tool for all types of invasive plants, but for some it is. Prescribed fire can reduce fuel buildup and chances for severe wildfires, like I mentioned earlier. And this is a really important thing to discuss with people. If you're educating people about prescribed fire, or you have a friend or family member that comes to visit Florida and is concerned about, smoke they see from a prescribed fire, or how could they possibly burn the forest down? That's horrible. Well, not only is it not horrible, it's actually very good for the forest and the plants and animals in the forest, but it's also increases the safety for us humans and our structures by reducing the fuel, so that if there is a lightning strike or somebody throws that cigarette out their car window, there is a decreased chance for a severe wildfire to start. Prescribed fires also can provide beautiful areas where we can enjoy wildlife and scenery, and improve recreational opportunities for us humans as well. All right, so I'm going to turn it over now to my husband, Tony Clements, who started his journey with the Florida Park Service in 1993 as a volunteer. He then became a full-time resident ranger, living in Oscar Scherer State Park. So he has lived in Oscar Scherer for almost 30 years, minus the 5 years that we went out to Washington State for me to go to medical school. So we got married in the park. Cassidy actually came to the park last night to film a video with me, and we filmed it right in the area where Tony and I got married in '98. And then we came back to Sarasota and Oscar Scherer State Park in 2003, where he was given the job of assistant manager and then promoted to park manager in 2012. He enjoys sharing his passion for the outdoors with everyone he comes in contact with. All right, Tony, go ahead and take it away. You have to unmute yourself, sir.
How about now? Is that better?
That is perfect.
Can you hear me now? Excellent, excellent. Well, welcome everybody to virtual Oscar Scherer State Park. I'm talking to you from my backyard, and you can see the park in the background. So I wanted to talk specifically about, as a land manager, as a park manager, our perspective on the importance of fire in shaping and restoring and protecting our natural resources. So I wanted to start by sharing the Florida Park Service mission statement with you. So our mission statement is to provide resource-based recreation while preserving, interpreting, and restoring natural and cultural resources. So the way that I look at this, it's a balance. We want to provide a great place for people to come, relax, and enjoy and learn about these wonderful resources we have, while we protect and preserve these resources for future generations. So the way that we do that, I kind of think of our natural resources as, if we were a business thinking mindset, as our product. So everybody wants to have a great product because everybody wants to experience that product. So our great product or service that we provide are these beautiful natural and cultural resources. And the way that we save and protect these and restore these areas is using prescribed fire. So of course, I've got to share a little bit of history about Oscar Scherer State Park with you. So in 1955, Elsa Scherer Burroughs donated 462 acres to the state, which then became Oscar Scherer State Recreation Area, and the park was opened in 1956. In 91, we also acquired another 922 acres, and that's specifically due to the scrub habitat in the Florida scrub jay, and then we acquired some additional acres over the year. So as you can see, we're at about 1,400 acres here at Oscar Scherer State Park. Also, we have the Scherer-Thaxton Preserve, which is a county preserve of 287 acres adjacent to the park also. Next slide, please. So this is just showing a little bit of, this is just back in 1995, and it shows the park now, what it looked like then. So as you know, Oscar Scherer State Park is quite an urban park. But not so much back even in 1995. So next slide, and I want to show you just the development that's gone on around the park. So as you can see, all along that west side is now developed, and everywhere that you see a red circle on this map are areas that are either in development right now or will be developed within the next year. So just north of the park, west of the park, south of the park. So as you can see, within 1 year, Oscar Scherer State Park is basically going to become an island. We will be completely surrounded by development. And that creates a lot of challenges for us to try to provide a great habitat at Oscar Scherer State Park. So here are some of the challenges that we have. It's a lot harder to do this prescribed fire when we're completely surrounded by development, because that smoke's got to go somewhere, correct? It doesn't always go up. It's got to settle somewhere. So that's something that we'll talk a little bit more about. And when we write our prescriptions, it's much harder for us to do the resource management that's desperately needed. It's also going to reduce the animal and plant diversity that we have in the park by being surrounded. And it's also going to increase the potential for more invasive species. We've been working really, really hard with the developers, and we've been working with them. So when they do landscape these areas, they'll be using native species. So the chances of having influenced by the outside developments from exotics is going to be lower, because we're working with these developers to make sure they're only using native species, or at least non-invasive species planted within these adjacent areas to the park. We do have South Creek, that creek that runs right through the park, all to the north, is also developed. So we've also got to consider the downstream impacts of fertilization and all those things that happen as folks move into these areas. Luckily, we've been working with the developers, and we've created buffers along these creek corridors, not only as wildlife corridors, but also so these areas aren't getting sodded all the way down to the water, which then would need to have fertilizer attached. So these are some of the challenges that we're going to be continuing to have, and it's only going to get tighter and tighter. And we want to make sure that we're also providing wildlife corridors for these animals to be able to disperse from Oscar Scherer State Park also. Next slide, please.
Tony, while we're on this slide, will you just mention, because we can see the colors indicating the different natural plant communities, will you mention which colors are indicative of fire-dependent communities?
Yeah, so at Oscar Scherer State Park, we've got 7 plant communities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the next slides. But you can see the different colors there. Probably the browner color, that's our mesic pine flatwoods. So typically, those habitats burn on a 2 to 4 year rotation. So every 2 to 4 years, we try to burn those areas. And what we're trying to do, again, is mimic that natural process that all these plants and animals have come to need to be healthy. So we're just mimicking that natural process that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years. The green, kind of through the heart of the park, the lighter green, that's our scrubby flatwoods. So scrubby flatwoods typically burns on anywhere from a 5 to 15 year rotation. So we call it our fire return interval. So every 5 to 15 years, we will introduce fires into those areas. The darker spotted greens are our depression marshes. The blue colors are our wetlands and hammock areas. And of course, the creek and other areas. The light white areas are kind of our either lakes or built up areas, like our picnic areas and things like that. So as you can see, there's a lot of habitat, and most of the habitat around the edges and fringes of the park are within that 2 to 4 year fire return interval. So we have to burn those on a regular basis. Again, not only to provide great habitat for the plants and animals that depend on it, but also to reduce the fuel loads so that when we do have lightning strikes, and we average about 3 to 4 lightning strikes, wildfires a year at Oscar Scherer State Park, so it's not an if, it's when. Because we introduce fire on a regular cycle, those wildfires are much easier for us to maintain because we've been reducing that fuel from year to year. Again, 7 unique plant communities. We have 13 listed plant species in the park. And what we mean by listed is just ones that are protected in one manner or another because there's not as many of them as there used to be, or the habitats are rare and you don't find these species around as much anymore. We have 23 listed animal species, and most of our restoration work in the park started in the early 80s. So a lot of the brown areas were dense and overgrown. A lot of that scrub, that green in the center, was overgrown and was starting to change from scrub to a different type of habitat. So again, in our mission statement, one of the things that we do is restore. Restoration is one of those things. So we look at that area, we try to figure out what that looked like when the first settlers came to Florida. And we try to get many of these areas back to that place, because again, that's going to create great biodiversity. It's going to provide great habitat for our plants and animals. So then future generations can come out and enjoy the same things that we are seeing in these areas today. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we manage Oscar Scherer State Park, and then specifically for fire, but also for invasives and other things, is we need to separate the park into management zones. So at Oscar Scherer State Park, we've separated the park into 52 management zones. Each one of those management zones has a unique prescription written for it on how we're going to burn it, that specific details on how we're going to burn that specific piece of property, that specific management zones. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit more about prescribed fire, this was a burn, excuse me, that we did right next to my house. And this was my daughter's in college right now, but at the time when we did this burn, of course, she was much smaller and she had this UTV. So we thought it would be interesting to, this is not one of the pieces of fire equipment that we use on the fire line. We just did this just to throw in a little bit of fun. So hands down, prescribed fire is the cheapest and best tool we can use to restore the resources, those natural resources found within the park. Again, mimicking that natural process that's been going on. So we're about 1,400 acres here at the park. So now we've burned the whole park, if you were to look at it, over 10 times over the years. You know, we're trying to keep all those management zones in their fire return intervals, because the more we do that, the healthier the habitat, the lower the fuel building. Again, most of it started in the 80s. Right now, the park is at about 80% of the park is in its fire return interval. Of course, some years we can get a lot more burning done than others, because again, we have to wait for all those planets to line up so we have the exact position, stuff that we need to move forward. So I want to talk more about specifically scrub habitat here at Oscar Scherer, because it has very specific needs. So this is a good example of what scrub should look like. This gentleman is about 5'10", so you can see most of that scrubs play out about 5 foot high. Not so many pine trees in the background, maybe 2 to 3 pine trees per habitat. That's what you want. And the way that we keep that habitat in that shape is by reintroducing fire. We talked about scrub. We talked about fire return intervals. About every 5 to 15 years, we're going to reintroduce fire into that habitat. It's not as easy as that. I wish it was. Habitat such as scrub burn under very extreme conditions. So in order to burn those areas, we've got to sometimes use machines to break down that habitat. So this is our burn plan that you're looking at right now. So we make a burn plan for every year. So this is last year's burn plan. So everything in red was on our burn plan from last year. Last year, we only burned 3 of our 15 zones because we just all those planets didn't line up for us. So many of those zones now are moved on to this year's plan. So we have created a new plan each year, and then we update those prescriptions, we update everything so we're ready to burn when we have those proper conditions and all those planets aligned for us. So we're all ready to get that area burned. So then we call in to Florida Forest Service to get our authorization to burn. We get an authorization number, and then we gather all the crew so we can get it done. So basically every day we are ready to burn. All that we're waiting for is for the weather parameters and everything else to line up so we can make that burn happen. Next slide. Excuse me. So one of the things that we use, for example, we talked about scrub. Scrub typically burns when the winds are 20, 25 miles an hour and the humidity's really low, maybe like 40 to 30%. If we were to try to do a prescribed fire under those conditions, we would not be able to manage that fire. That fire would spot over. We wouldn't be able to control it within its area. So one of the ways that we can reduce, we're not really reducing the fuels, all we're doing is changing the fuel arrangement. So instead of the fuels being like this, we're laying it down. So now fire can pass through that area and it dries out. Fire can pass through that area when the winds are 10 miles an hour, when the humidity is at 50%. And under those conditions, it's much easier for us to manage that fire and better control what that fire is going to do on the fire lines. Now, a lot of people say, what are you doing? You're taking this big machine, you're running over there, there's gopher tortoises, there's all kinds of animals in there. Before we do any of that work, before that machine goes out there, we go out and we mark any sensitive areas. We mark off any gopher tortoise burrows or anything else where we don't want the machine operator to take that machine. So we want to make sure that we're doing the best thing we can for the resources out there. So once we reduce that fuel, we can burn it under more favorable conditions that we can manage that fire a little bit better. And this is a skidder with a roller chopper in the back. So here's an example of before mechanical treatment. This scrub's probably about 10 to 12 feet tall, it's overgrown. And then the next slide is what it looks like after. So now fire can pass through that area a lot easier than at standing scrub. So it's much easier for us to manage it under these conditions, especially given that we are in such an urban area. So let's talk a little bit about the prescription. So the prescription has many, many parts. The prescription can be anywhere for each of those 52 zones. That prescription is anywhere from 10 to 20 pages long. So we don't take this thing lightly. We want to make sure, and I'm a very conservative burner, so I only wait for those planets to line up in order for me to apply fire on the ground, because what I'm most concerned about is I'm concerned for the safety of my crew. I'm concerned for the safety of our neighbors. And I'm also want to make sure that I meet the objectives that I've written within that prescription for that specific management zone. So this is some of the general information. There's a lot of training that all of our staff on the fire line goes through in order to put fire on the ground. We put a description of what that zone looks like, what conditions are adjacent to those fuels. For example, if that fire was to spot over in an adjacent zone, we know what kind of fuels are in that zone, so we know how we need to fight that. We also write in contingency plan. If it was to spot in that, what crew is going to go fight that zone, how they're going to fight it, if it gets bigger at a certain size to pull in additional resources. Typically, you're going to get spot overs on a fire. You know, I would say 50% of the fires that we do, we get spot overs on them. The key is having enough crew and resources to be able to manage those spots when they happen. This is an example of some of the resource management objectives that we put in there. And also, we've got to think about that smoke. I think Catherine had mentioned what happened when that nighttime dispersion came down and the fog came down and mixed in with that smoke from a prescribed fire that got out of hand. And then that created conditions that were unfavorable for vehicles so they could not see. So all these factors we think about, and we make sure all those conditions and all those planets line up so we can do that fire. So here's a smoke management plan in the next slide. We do this to see where that smoke's going to go the next day, that morning. Basically, we don't know if we're going to burn until that morning, and we'll do a test fire. If that test fire, if we're not seeing, if we're getting really high fire behaviors and things aren't looking good, guess what? We're shutting it down. Safety is always first. We want to make sure that we do this safe, because all it takes is one bad prescribed fire to get out of hand to shut down the whole fire program across the state. So we fire managers take this very seriously because it can be life and death, and we've seen examples of that. So it's a serious matter. We make sure everybody knows what they're doing on the fire line. And it's really important for us to educate folks so they understand how we're doing it and why we're doing it. Again, we want to make sure we have escape routes and safety zones, areas we've just burned, so if the fire does escape, the crew can go to that area and they'll be safe. Again, we talked about contingency plans for how we're going to fight that fire if it does get out of hand. I'm always thinking, as the burn boss on the fire, of worst case scenario, what I'm going to do if that wind shifts 180 degrees and it starts blowing like crazy. How am I going to handle that fire? Those scenarios are constantly running through my mind when I'm on that fire line, the night before and the night after. Again, we want to make sure all those planets line up. We want to make sure we've got good temperature. We want to make sure the winds are out of the right direction. We want to make sure we have the relative humidity. There's all these factors that we have to look at. And when we write a prescription, we write in parameters. So the temperature, we want it between this range and this range. The wind directions, we want out of the west. And they need to stay west for not only that day, but the next day, so that that smoke's going to continue going in the right direction. The humidity, we want it at a certain factor. The lavori, the fine dyed fuel, there's all these factors, all these things that have to line up before we consider applying fire to the ground. And we look at all those prescriptions as our resource to make sure that we're lined up to make that happen. Next slide. Excuse me. So let's talk a little bit about some of the equipment that the fire crew have out on the line. So the picture to the left, you see the gentleman there, they're all dolled up. Now we're doing these burns. We try to line these burns up so that they happen when these areas naturally burn. So guess when that is? In the summer. Guess what it is? It's really, really hot. Now you think it's hot just being out right now? Think about having all that gear on and walking through the woods where you've got fire within 5 feet of you and get all that radiant heat. It gets really, really hot on there. So we're make sure that we've got each other's backs out on there and everybody's taking crew. The crew are taking enough breaks and you've got enough resources that you can fold people out. Someone can go sit in the truck for a few minutes while you've got someone else stringing fire and all those types of things. So that gentleman to the left has a drip torch. That drip torch is the tool we use to light the fire. It's basically a mix between diesel fuel and unleaded gasoline. It's got a wick on the end, and as you drip it, it drips fire out so we can put fire along the line. Again, safety first. You got to make sure you got that helmet, the goggles, you've got a radio so you can communicate. You've got that, if you look on the back of the picture of me, along my back, that's called a fire shelter. Everybody on the fire line needs to always have their fire shelter on you. Because again, you're always thinking worst case scenario. So whenever I'm on the fire line, I'm thinking about if I had to deploy my shelter, which is basically a big aluminum sack, if I was having to get in there to protect myself from this fire that's coming, I need to think about where I could deploy this shelter and open up enough space where I'm not going to get burned up. And these things, all wildland firefighters must carry these packs with them, and they go through training to make sure they deploy them under all kinds of weather conditions. Because if you think about it, if you ever had to deploy that pack, you're going to be stressed out, you're going to be exhausted. So you want to make sure that this becomes second nature. It's muscle memory for you. So you know how to deploy that pack and you know how to deploy it and where to deploy it. You got a whistle, you got a compass, you got all the Nomax burn gear. You want to make sure you have all that. The equipment that you carry with you, there's all different types of equipment. So this, what you're seeing here is a UTV. It's a small piece of equipment. It's got a 60-gallon tank that slides in the bank. These pieces of equipment are versatile. You can get them down a trail. You can get them to work on a spot really quick, where some of the Type 6, the other engines that you use on a fire line, can be a little bit more unwieldy and it takes a little harder to get through. Here's an example of a Type 6. The best fires that I've been on are the fires where I haven't had to put one drop of fire on that fire. So again, the more we burn it, the more often we burn it, the fire comes through. When the fire is done, there's no smoldering, it goes out because there's not much fuel there. You don't have to put one drop of water on it. That's kind of where we want to get. Now we've got a lot of work to get us there, especially in some of these areas that haven't seen fire before. So we just burned an area recently and we're going to show you some pictures of that. And that's an area that has no fire history whatsoever. So there's certain processes we have to go through in order to get that zone back to the way that it used to be, to restore that area. It's going to be a lot more than one fire to get that done. Again, this area has not seen any fire. And you can see that little red circle. That's the area that we were burning. We were burning right up against people's backyards. So guess what? On that prescription, which way do you think the wind was coming out of on that prescription? We needed to have a west wind. When we say west wind, that means the wind was coming out of the west. So it's coming out of the west and heading east. So we're blowing smoke away from that residence area. We're blowing smoke away from that community back into the park. And those zones to the east, we've burned all those zones within the last 4 months. So we know that those areas are not going to carry fire. So that helps us in managing those areas. So what we want to do, we want it to be a little bit wet because that area that hasn't seen fire, the duff or the fuel that's on the ground under those pine trees is about 2 foot thick, okay? If we were to burn all that off in one fire, first of all, that duff would burn for days and days and days and days, and it's gonna kill that pine tree because a lot of the fine roots from that pine tree are within that duff. So what we're trying to do that first year when it's kind of wet after we rain, we're burning off maybe 2 inches of that duff. And then when we come back in a couple of years and burn it off again, we're burning off 2 inches of that duff. Again, it takes many, many burns to get those areas back restored the way that they once were. And again, and that's our ultimate goal, is to restore these areas back to the way that they were. Next slide. So here's a perfect example. This is the area, this is the fire we just did on Tuesday. That fire right there is 10 feet away from people's pools. So you can imagine it takes a lot of education for these folks to feel, maybe not use the word comfortable, but knowing that the crew that are out there working on that fire know what they're doing. And we've talked to these folks so many times about the benefits of fire. We've reduced this fuel now. So let's say there was in 2 years, there's a lightning strike over to the left and the winds are coming out of the east. Instead of pushing the smoke away, it'd be pushing towards. But because we've been burning these areas, that fuel intensity is going to be low. It's going to be much easier for us or the fire department coming in from the neighborhood to be able to defend these areas. So again, it takes a lot of education and understanding for these folks to realize the importance of prescribed fire, especially when it's right in your backyard. So everything went well. We got a lot of great comments from these neighbors. In fact, I got an email saying that they saw a deer munching on some of the new growth, and you can imagine this burn was just done and they're already seeing new growth in there. Again, the native plants and animals and the plants need that fire. Again, you're releasing a lot of nutrients into the ground. The animals come in and lick up those nutrients, and the plants are like, hey, look at this, I can see the sun. Now everything can start, all those native plants can start growing again. So fire is an important tool we use, and we have a high, what we call urban interface at Oscar Scherer State Park, which means that we're right in an urban area. So it's really important that we do everything we can to do those prescribed fires in a safe manner so that we can continue to do those, because that's what's best for the natural resources, the plants and animals, and our neighbors up to those parks by fuel reduction. Next slide.
All right, so Tony, I think I'm going to take it over from here and show some pictures of some other recent burns from back in May. And we're almost at the end of us talking, and then we'll do Q&A. So let me just share some pictures with you. This is, I have 2 different fires from May. This was May 21. This is all of these pictures. I was standing on my back porch, basically where Tony's sitting right now. So this was the zone right behind where Tony is sitting. It's right adjacent to our house. This burn was within 20, 30 feet of our house at points. So here is a ranger. He's got a drip torch that you can't see because his back is to us, but he is setting down some fire back in the saw palmetto there. And you can see sort of the fire to the right of the screen as well that he had just recently set. There's someone with a drip torch as well. This is after the fire, so you can see a little bit of mosaic. Generally, the fire managers and burn bosses, they don't want to burn. It's not like they're going to burn everything to the ground. We call it a mosaic. We want to have a mosaic of how much burns, and there's going to be some greenery left. Some of the pine trees might be scorched. Sometimes it's actually an objective to kill some of the pine trees. If you're in a scrubby flatwoods, you don't want to have very many tall trees and tall pine trees. So if there has been fire suppression over the years, there may be more tall trees and pine trees than you want. And so part of your objective may be that some of those are damaged by the fire. But also our pine trees manage very well. They have a number of adaptations that help them survive fires too. So most of the ones in this picture, they're going to survive just fine. But you can see the mosaic. The mosaic also allows animals a place to go to seek refuge, whether they're smaller animals going into a gopher tortoise burrow or a scrub jay to fly to an adjacent zone, deer to exit. So it's pretty cool. You can see all sorts of animals sort of exiting the zone. And this is also why there are those different zones, so that the land managers and the burn bosses really think about where are animals going to be able to escape to. Is there an adjacent area that scrub jays can get to so we aren't damaging their population or creating too much stress? All of that is taken into account by that prescription, by the biologists that work hand in hand with our burn managers. Here's a deer. So Tony was just mentioning how the neighborhood resident saw a deer. In both of the fire pictures I'm going to show you, I have deer pictures in both. And this is immediately after the fire. I was out there, and the deer are out there too. They're going to eat the new growth when the new growth comes up, but immediately after the fire, they're going to lick up the ash, which provides the plants and animals with added nutrients. So then I have more pictures from the May 5th fire. Once again, this was also behind my house, but it was in the zone north of the zone fire that we just looked at. And for this fire, I was out closer to the active burn, so I got a few more pictures a little after they had done ignition. So a lot of my pictures are smoke pictures, but you really get a sense for it by looking at some of these pictures. And here we are on one of the lines with the fire crew. This actually was a spot over that day. So Tony and I were going around the outskirts of the zone, Tony checking on the fire, me getting an opportunity to do some photography. And we came around the corner, and here the burn had spotted over into the zone south of the burn. And this is actually my house right here. So this is the zone that then got burned a few weeks later on that May 21st burn, but this was not supposed to happen. My house is right there, and Tony's job as burn boss is he then just calls the crew over, or part of the crew over, to help manage the spot over. They put it out within, less than a couple minutes. So on the right-hand side of your picture is the edge of the burn that was supposed to happen. Then, of course, you see sort of a road or a trail. Often the trails in our county and state parks here in Florida are actually active management areas where they are providing a fire break in between burn zones. So this fire just jumped from the right-hand side of your screen to the left-hand side of the screen across the fire break, and it really only burned a very small area. So on the left-hand side of your screen is the area where the spot over happened. Here's a picture post-burn, and we have some communities on the north of the park there that you can see the roof right there through the trees, also very close to that northern edge. And just here's some plants. These are some pines and some, I believe this is, that might be oak or it might be gopher apple. So here are just some plant responses. You can see the plants get scorched. Saw palmettos have an underground rhizome, so even if the fire comes through, even if it burns the above ground portions of the saw palmetto will be one of the first plants to resprout within hours or days because that underground rhizome survives, and some of those rhizomes we think are hundreds of years old. And here's the deer we saw that day. This was the evening of the day of the fire. And actually I didn't get a good picture, but right behind this female deer is a fawn that we were able to see. It's actually in this picture hidden in the brush. But it got a little bit darker. We sat and watched the deer for a while. It got a little bit darker, and then I couldn't get a good picture by the time the baby stood up and moved along with the mom. But she's in here with her baby. They were both totally fine. She's licking up the ash and eating some of those plants that have been exposed. And here it is that evening. Of course, the fire managers are going to go out on the fire throughout the evening. They're going to be checking the fire every few hours or more often if conditions require that. There certainly can be smoke and things burning within the center of the zone or just releasing smoke, but they are managing it to make sure that there aren't any concerning areas that could spot over. So I want to thank you all for being here. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. That is my email address here at UF IFAS Extension, Sarasota County. We're going to have time for Q&A, but at any time, if you have any questions or you have any natural resource, wildlife sort of questions or needs, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for being here with us today. We hope that you're doing well this summer and you have a safe, healthy, and happy August.